Chapter 9. To Views with Lasting Memory. "Oh, sweet Jesus, keep me up," Gary said under his breath. With every motion of the crane, there was always a slight swaying of the tower. Although used to the motion and aware that it was a constant, he felt the visceral invigoration it brought to him every instant that he swiveled the machine, and especially when it hoisted a load. The sensation overwhelmed his sense of self-preservation, and it was only with great and careful distraction that he kept himself from bursting into perpetual tears. As he knew the form of his emotions could be catastrophic to the functions of his station, he would try to keep his distracting thoughts of such nature that he could easily have dominion over their course, so to maintain their presence and still be in control. It was a delicate balance that he had to perform with ongoing certainty. The parallel that such an exacting and incredible performance of his thinking, distracting, but not too distracting, was the marvel of the tower crane he controlled. He appreciated the machine and came to understand that his control of it was mirrored by the similar control of his patterns of thoughts it demanded from him. The cascade of influence ran in both directions. His thoughts were entirely human and indicative of his experience, but not the most emotionally wrenching of his life. He thought of those tough-to-ponder realities and would move their heavy frames with careful attention to their structure and the surroundings in which he moved them in order to be able to examine them in total and perhaps dismantle them and use them to construct a larger and more stable form of being. He tried his best to keep his focused distractions as clear as the contradiction of the notion of a focused distraction. He wondered if he was doing well enough for the course of his life to merit his enjoyment. He readily worried about the shape of the world of human reality, given the course of events throughout the entire world. He had reason to be concerned about the mounting tensions present in the international community, as they were made known to him through the various informational channels which he used to cobble together his view of events, to see them without bias by locating contradictory biases in the reporting. He found most of his news via radio and online social media, making his time spent in the seclusion afforded by a bathroom educational, to say the least. The articles he found online were of his own searching, and very rarely did he look into those posted publicly by friends and acquaintances. Although there was a constant stream of controversy and misery for him to wade through, what he found most disconcerting was the current issue of refugees running from their homeland that was war-torn by internal conflicts. The reports of the persons fleeing into Europe seemed to not be a large concern for him, as it was quite a distance from his physical reality, but the notion that such could still occur in this world was unsettling for him. This was the 21st century. Surely there was some standard of civility that should have been achieved by this point in human history, which would make such terrible situations as people fleeing from warfare in their own country obsolete. Piled onto this matter was the present state of affairs that gave rise to a terroristic threat from what he had come to term misguided minds seeking revenge of some sort. This deep-seated anger that some people felt was at grinding odds with he didn't know what. He tried to think from the standpoint of the terrorists, so to understand what could drive a person to such horrific extensive action, but he came up empty when extending empathy to those persons perpetuating violence. It felt like a new form of tyranny that was seeking to constrict upon the very idea of freedom. He wondered why it was so difficult to let time pass for those who felt so wrong, and then he felt the slight sway of the crane and reminded himself how fortunate he was to be the person he was. He had no misgivings about the social privilege afforded to him by the ascribed attributes of his gender, the color of his skin, his religious and national upbringing. He tried his best to be aware of it, so that he could be grateful for his situation. He could not imagine the extent of frustrations for those whom the threat of violence seems a fact of life, because he had never been in a situation as perilous as to warrant such a view. Sure, he had gotten angry over things in the past. He would feel the desire to use force to make the world conform to his ideas. Yet he found that the world, as it unfolded without his active forcing, was so close enough to his idea that he could let time reconcile the difference between what he wanted to be and what would be. The crane barely lurched forward as it lifted the load below along the cable to raise it aloft. If Gary had reason to be angry at any point, he would need to imagine impossibilities, or those things that he wished were to remain impossibilities. The only way he could see a justification for violence was if he imagined the aftermath of some person doing unspeakable harm to his daughter. He would, at that end, be done with civility, and the gloves would come off. He would tear and rip the world asunder and find no recourse for mercy until his anger was quenched by the flowing blood of all those he found caused whatever unimaginable horror they brought to his daughter. The load swung into the level, and the crane came to stand fully upright again as the hooks were disconnected. That he found only impetuous hatred as what could be a common point between he and humans prone to terror plots urged him to a sense of pity for them. Yet, by his upbringing, he had come to view pity as a byproduct of pride, and pride was not a quality becoming of a good Christian man. Self-reflection came upon him like a gentle breeze upon the upright tower in which he sat. He allowed his brain and body to perform the guided motions that fulfilled the task set by the voice coming over the radio, and his deep thoughts, his mind, discovered aspects of his own being that were questionable by the standards of personal ethics to which he continually strove to uphold. The righteous might of the machine needs an equally righteous man at its helm, and he knew that he would require a constant checking of himself, a self-vigilance, to meet the high standard he set for himself by the very virtue of the great height his station in society, high above the streets, afforded him. He allowed himself to recall something from the last month that sat heavy on his soul. He was spending the day with Julia, while Nadia was having a day to herself. Nadia was working out, going to her sculpting class, and then going to get a massage, and Gary was having a day with only he and Julia. They went for a morning walk along Town Lake, and then to the Capitol building. Somewhere during the tour they were a part of, it was becoming clear that she was tired, and so they left the group early to go to one of his favorite restaurants on the south side of the river. He would have gone to the Vietnamese place on Old Torf if he were on his own, but he was more attentive to the quality of ingredients when dealing with his daughter, and brought her to the Thai restaurant that was known for its fresh homemade ice cream, and to be the spot where regularly seen was a TV star who lived locally. Julia made it clear it was not her favorite spot, and she mentioned a place that she had learned about on the east side of 6th Street, which had really good bread pudding. While wondering why he was aware of this, he smoothly performed the change of plans and directed them to the location on the north side of the river. He learned that she was made privy to the location by using the local newspaper application on the family tablet, and they enjoyed a weekend brunch accompanied by a jazz trio that conjured a mellow atmosphere in what was, in essence, a pub. The food, however, was very high caliber and shot through their hunger with delightful flavors and textures. Father and daughter had a lovely morning, and he figured he would trust her inclinations to decide what they would do for the early afternoon. He was pleasantly surprised when she suggested they both go and put a few hours in at the local big organic garden. He had heard of the enterprise before and thought about doing it. He supported the endeavor at the farmers' market when he could get to them, but they offered the chance for people to work for a few hours in order to get a box of veggies. It was one of those proud moments for him that his 10-year-old daughter would suggest and seemed excited to try it with her dad. He said that he would stop on the way for some water, and they could give it a try. They were walking back to his car, and she held his hand while they crossed the street, a gesture unneeded at this point, but one that warmed his heart. As they were alongside the car, he opened the back door for her, and a man about his age rode on a bicycle in the intended direction of the traffic. He moved wide to give Gary and Julia space. Gary looked at the man on the bike to assure the space needed would be granted, and, as if sensing the unspoken request for space, the man on the bicycle said, "There you go." Gary nodded and said thanks as Julia hopped into the car. While he shut the door, the man stopped the bicycle just past the front of the car and turned to face Gary. "Let me ask you something," he said. "Could you help me out so I can get a meal for my son?" Gary looked at the man, and what would have been pity molted into a blatant anger. Retaining his composure and his sense of self, Gary responded, "No, man. I'm sorry." "I'm sorry, man. You look like you're doing well." The man started pedaling. "You have a nice day." Gary got in the car and closed the door. "What did that guy say?" Julia asked. "Oh, he was asking for help," he replied, and then added, but there seemed to be something insincere about it, hoping to justify to his daughter why he did not help a person who asked him. "Okay," she said, and then asked him to put the radio station that was her favorite on, hoping to hear a popular song that she had heard and enjoyed. And that was it. She didn't mention it again, and it slipped into memory, and perhaps only his memory. But there was a great deal of significance in that memory for him. The connection of multiple layers was clear at the beginning of the moment for him, and he thought back to it. He had wanted to tell Julia that the guy had asked for help for his child, but was doing it at a time when Gary's own child was in the car alone waiting for her father. That Gary's first reaction was that the guy was not a father, but attempting to play on Gary's situation for sympathy. Yet then he thought better of it. Perhaps the guy did have a son, and perhaps Gary did seem to be doing well enough to ask for help. If so, perhaps Gary was being the example of fatherhood the guy needed to see. Truthfully, Gary was not in the best of financial situations, but maybe he could have helped out the man who was brave enough to ask for help from someone he thought would understand his pains. Yet Gary had read an earnest insincerity in the request, and it struck a deeper chord with him and had stirred a deeper memory within him. When he was younger, perhaps younger than Julia was right now, he remembers being in the back seat of his father's car. He remembers the frustration his father expressed over getting a parking ticket that was soon vented in an aggressive tone toward the officer checking parking meters a few cars down the street. From his open window, Gary's father asked why the officer had given him a ticket, that it was just a few extra minutes and the guy must have nothing better to do than to give tickets. The officer said that if the meter was expired, he had his job to do. Gary watched his father fume in anger and lean his head out of the window and yell a word charged with such anger, a word that began with the 14th letter of the alphabet that would be nasty to yell at an officer with dark skin complexion. His father drove away, and Gary watched the look of sadness on the face of the officer as his face followed the car from which the racial slur had been emitted. That the guy on the bicycle was black made Gary think of that moment from his own childhood. He recalled the discomfort he felt toward his father after that, and hoped that Julia's silence was not indicative of similar feeling toward him. Gary had remained quiet and never mentioned it to his father after it had happened, but the event stayed with him. He hoped that Julia did not see him in such a way as he saw his father. He hoped her silence on the matter did not mean she felt the same helplessness he had felt. He hoped that his action, or his inaction as it were, would not drive a wedge between he and his daughter. There had been something more altruistic than just seeing how he could benefit from the situation, how helping someone else could be something that elevated his stature in the eyes of his child. He wondered if he could really consider himself a good Christian, seeing as he did not extend help to someone who had been bold enough to ask. Why did he automatically assume the request was insincere? Perhaps he was no better than those who would deny help to refugees fleeing death and war in their homeland. Perhaps he was racist, and that thought scared him. From his lofty perch above the streets, his view stretched far. He let himself be scared so his fear of the tower collapsing would not paralyze him.